started. I'm going to start recording. We're going to start class. So first off, welcome to our Unit 3 live session. Good to see all of y'all. We have a special guest today. Happy Friday. This is the last Friday before all of the possible going back to campus, having in-person, face-to-face classes for some of you. Our class is going to stay remote the whole time, so don't worry about that for us. But some of y'all might actually wind up having in-person classes next week. But anyway, we have a special guest who's going to start off class today. We have a representative from the tutoring services who's going to tell us about tutoring center and writing center possible services you can use at your time at Kane. So Tracy, are you ready to talk about the tutoring services?
Yes, I am.
Hi, Tracy.
Hello, how are you?
Good.
Is there a way I can share my screen?
Yeah, under the little share content box, you should have the ability to click share application/screen.
Okay.
That's next to the little people box in the settings. There you go.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tracy. I'm an academic specialist from the Kane Tutoring Center. Our location is usually located at the Learning Commons library. So right now we're offering remote services through the learningcommons.kane.edu, and I'm going to talk about the what are the services that the tutoring center offer, as well as the writing service. So our goal as a tutoring center is to provide all students with the opportunity to achieve the highest grade possible, as well as to master the academic content to progress in their academic careers. We offer a wide range of undergraduate courses, as well as ranging from introductory level to senior courses. We also have tutors who are able to help you with Praxis math, as well as GRE math if needed. Right now, we're operating remotely and we're open 7 days a week. So we have tutors from to Fridays from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. On Saturdays, we have tutors from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. And on Sundays, we have tutors from noon to 7 p.m. You can always make an appointment through TutorTrack, or if you didn't make an appointment, you can always drop in through TutorTrack as well. On the earlier link, there was on the first slide, there was a link that directs you to learningcommons.kane.edu. On there, you're able to find resources for tutoring as well. If you're not able to get an appointment, or you are having some difficulty outside of our appointment hours, you can go to this website and you can find concept videos on that you're not sure about. We also offer writing services. The writing tutors are able to work with students throughout all the stages of the writing process, from the drafting all the way to the editing and proofreading. These tutors are available to all students with all kinds of writing assignments. So if you have research papers you need help with, you can go to a writing tutor. If you have job applications that you need help with, you can go to a writing tutor. They also have writing resources on the learningcommons.kane.edu site, so you can also go there to check it out. We also have public speaking tutors who are able to help students with oral presentation and help them gain and build skills to present their work best. All these services that we offer, you can make an appointment through TutorTrack. It's through tutortrack.kane.edu. You just need to when you get there, you just need to sign in through your Kane credentials, and you automatically can choose whatever appointment that you want to make. Once it's time for your scheduled session, you can arrive to your session early on TutorTrack, and on TutorTrack, it will direct you to Zoom. You don't need to sign into your Zoom account. You don't need a Zoom account. It will direct you directly to the tutor's Zoom meeting, and at your scheduled time, your tutor will allow you in the meeting and you can start your tutoring session. We also have Blackboard resources for students, and this way you're able to access tips and tools through Blackboard of navigating Blackboard. And we also have weekly Blackboard workshops. If you have any questions for the tutoring center, you can always contact my supervisor, Ms. Angulo. Or if you have any questions for the writing center, you can always contact Ms. Michelle Fabio, and both of them are more than willing to help you guys. I will be emailing this presentation to your professor so you guys can have access to the links and stuff like that. Do you guys have any questions?
Okay, Tracy, it looks like we don't have any questions popping up. So I really appreciate you coming in to let us know about these services. Thank you so much for sharing this, Tracy.
You're welcome. Thank you for your time.
Have a good day.
You too.
All right. So now let's talk a little bit about what we're going to be doing with the rest of our live session today. Today's the week where we start talking about arguments in a lot more nitty-gritty detail. We're going to learn the basics of what an argument is, how we go about understanding those arguments, and then try to learn about evaluating those arguments. I always like to start off each live session, though, with a little bit of basic logistics about all the things you have to do during this particular unit. We're in Unit 3 right now, so I'm going to go to Course Content and then check out the Unit 3 folder, Arguments, the basics, right here. You got a couple things within here. Here are the slides we're going to be using during today's live session right here. Here are the reading assignments. Both are pretty short. This one's 4 pages on arguments, premises, and conclusions. This one's also pretty short on arguments, 4 pages, so not a ton of reading for class this week. That's the required stuff. And there are no optional resources for you to check out. So there are 2 basic assignments for you this week, and they're going to start seeming familiar. It's a discussion question and a participation activity. The discussion question is something I'm going to talk about in a lot more detail later on in the live session today. But in general, I'm asking you to defend a controversial opinion you have to hold. Come up with an argument to defend your controversial stance on something. So if any of you have taken a class from me before, as Shantae notes in the chat, a lot of this might be familiar. At least all of the examples will be new and interesting, but there's a lot of stuff that I do in my other philosophy classes that's going to mirror what happens in this particular class today. So anyway, for this Unit 3 discussion, take a controversial stance you hold, like your stance on God or some sort of moral claim. Maybe it could be on abortion or anything controversial, who knows. And then just tell us your actual reasons, your argument for why you believe what you believe. That's what you'll be putting forward in this particular unit. As always, we got Saturday and Wednesday deadlines in this class. Your first post is due Saturday by 11:59. Your 2 replies due Wednesday by 11:59 p.m. Making sure you try to post on 3 separate days throughout the week so you get full credit for your discussion grade. So here's your discussion. Your participation activity this week is on understanding arguments. During the live session, we'll be talking about this particular activity, going over a few things on here. It's 2 pages long. There are 10 things to check out on the first page. There's 1 long thing to check out on the second page. A reminder how I grade participation activities. If you do it completely, you get full credit, all 25 points out of a possible 25 points for doing it. That's how I grade all of your participation activities. And then there are some other things this week, like there's an optional extra credit you could do that's a chance for you to even understand arguments a little bit more. It looks a lot like your participation activity this week, but this is just a chance to do it even more if you wanted to. So that's just extra credit. If you do this one, it's worth up to 25 points added to your overall grade. And so that will just be added to your final grade. Shanae, I see your hand. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yes, so I looked at those worksheets.
Mhm.
I don't know exactly how to do it. Do we like circle it? Like, I don't,
Yeah,
like
so
how
it's
do
a good
we find?
question.
Mhm.
Yeah, so we'll be going over this actually. We'll probably be doing one or two of them together as a whole class later today, but just to show you a little bit here, the sample lets you know exactly what you're supposed to be doing here. You want to circle anything that counts as a premise indicator or a conclusion indicator. So this word because right here is a very nice premise indicator. That's the sort of word you would circle in this whole argument. And then you're supposed to underline the conclusion to the argument. And in this case, the sentence, "we must restrict protesters," is underlined. So that seems to be the thing that you would underline. So that's what you're going to be doing for every one of these first 8 arguments. There's slightly different directions for 9 and 10, slightly different directions for the second page. I promise we'll be going over this in more detail in the part of this live session later. But yeah, that's the gist of it. And it's the same basic thing you're doing for the extra credit as well. Again, circling indicators, underlining conclusions for all of these. So good question, Shanae. I'm glad you asked that. And then there's a couple more things in here. There's an ungraded activity you can just do for practice. We might be referencing this throughout class today, especially when we finish our conversation about how to evaluate arguments. And this is going to be a little bit of maybe practice for something you have to do next week. Next week, you'll have a homework assignment that'll look in part like this ungraded activity. So this is just a chance for you to practice this developing skill set on your own before you have to do a graded assignment on it next week. So ungraded activity, you don't have to hand that one in. That's not going to be due ever. You never hand that one in, but that's there. And then we're going to end class today by getting you into the groups you've been assigned to for your group projects on fallacies. If you remember last week during the live session, you were asked to fill out a poll or what was it, sort of click and drag topics based off of how interested you were in those topics. I formed those groups based off of what you did, and they're listed right here. We will be getting into those groups at the end of the live session today, so you can exchange contact information. I'm not going to do it right now, but I promise at the end of the live session, you're going to get a chance to get to know each other in your groups and exchange that contact information. All right, so that's all the Unit 3 stuff that we're going to be doing. 2 basic assignments you have to do, your discussion question posts and your participation activity. There's an optional extra credit assignment. There's an optional ungraded activity that you don't have to hand in. Your extra credit and participation activities are due Wednesday. So that's all the basic logistics. One other thing I wanted to mention that's not about Unit 3, but is instead about other stuff. If I go to the left-hand side of your course page here, there's the course menu bar. I'm going to click on My Grades. So right now, I have graded your Unit 1 discussion post, and I've graded your Unit 2 participation activity. So you should see grades for both of those under My Grades. So right here is the Unit 1 discussion question, how much do you believe, Sean? To the very far right over here, that's where you're going to see a grade out of 15 points. And then down here, Unit 2 participation activity, your rational life plan that you submitted by Wednesday, that will be something out of 25 points. Reminder for participation activities, and by and large, just make sure you do them and complete them, and you get the full 25 points out of 25 points. So for pretty much everybody who submitted your Rational Life Plan, you should see you got 25 out of 25 points. I tend to not provide feedback on your Rational Life Plans because they're for you. They're for you personally. They're your own project for you to use and think through yourself. So I'm not going to be offering feedback on that particular participation activity. But I did provide feedback on your Unit 1 discussion question. Now, you can find my feedback if you're unsure as to why it is you got the grade that you got. If you click on the little view rubric right below this Unit 1 discussion question. So you click on this and a new window pops up. Let me share that window that I just opened. It's rubric detail, and it lists all of the things in a little grid, a rubric, that I grade your discussion questions on. The quality of your first post, the quality of your responses to other students' posts, your frequency of posting, and whether you hit the deadlines for your posts. So you're going to see when you click to open this yourself for your Unit 1 discussion question, one of these boxes here highlighted. Like maybe maybe you got mastery, 4.995 points out of a possible 4.995 points for your quality grade. In that case, this box to the right here would be highlighted, and my feedback would be right below here. You would see what I wrote to explain why you got mastery for that. And then the same is going to be true for each one of these criteria. So maybe you got 3 points instead of 4 points on student responses to other students or faculty posts. My explanation for why you got 3 points out of 4 points will be below here. Same for frequency of student posts, same for timeliness. That's how you can check your feedback on your discussion post grades, so you get a chance to know why it is you got the grade you got, and you can maybe adjust your future discussion posting accordingly in response to this. So any questions, thoughts, concerns about anything logistics-based about this class at this time before we dive into what we're learning in class this week? Feel free to write no, I don't have any questions in the chat. Feel free to write your question in the chat if you do have a question. Feel free to raise your hands like Shanae did, and I can call on you. So Barbara's got no questions. Iris asked whether I accept late work. So the short answer is yes, but there is a little bit of a difference between late work for discussion questions and other late work like participation activities. So for discussion questions, there are aspects of that your grade depends on deadlines. So if you miss deadlines, you'll still get partial credit for your discussion questions, but you'll get points taken off, because part of discussion questions is about participating in the discussion with your other classmates while the discussion's happening. And that discussion only takes place from Thursday to Wednesday of a particular unit. So if you're posting outside of the deadlines, your initial post is submitted after Saturday, any of your replies are submitted after the Wednesday deadline, you're going to get some points off. You'll still get partial credit, but you'll get some points off. For other types of assignments, like your participation activities, or in next week there'll be a homework assignment, that sort of stuff. For those sorts of assignments, I typically accept late work as long as you email me. You sort of get in touch with me to let me know that I'm interested in getting some sort of an extension. We can have some sort of conversation about why it is you want to submit your work late. And then we can talk about whether I'm going to give you a late penalty or I won't give you a late penalty. So it's in your interest to email me. I tend to be pretty lenient on this. If you reach out to me and ask for some sort of extension, I'll usually say, sure, that's fine. But again, that's important that you do reach out to me to let me know. So that was a long answer, Iris. The short answer is submit your late work. If you submit it late, you'll at least get partial credit. Chances are if you email me, you'll also get just full credit. So, all right. Any other questions, thoughts, or concerns, feel free to post them in the chat. But otherwise, what we're going to do now is start talking about all of today's lesson. And I want to pick up where we left off in class last time. If you remember, one of the last things we were talking about during our live session last week was this distinction between intellectual dishonesty and intellectual honesty. Let's see if I can do something quick, by the way. I learned a trick between this week and last week where I can actually make this the whole screen. It took me only 6 months of teaching this way for me to learn this trick. But on the left side is what I think of as the evil use of logic, the skills we're going to be learning in this class, the skills of tricking and manipulating others by misusing arguments, trying to argue towards the goal of tricking people, persuading people, manipulating people, trying to win a battle, trying to seem smart. All of that was the intellectually dishonest side, using the tools of logic to trick and manipulate others. The good way that we're going to be trying to use logic in this class is the basic skills of reasoning, where our goal is to figure out the truth. Our goal is to gain a deeper, better understanding of the complicated world we find ourselves in. And the intellectually honest approach to the argumentative tools we're going to be learning in this class is using those tools in the pursuit of the truth, caring about truth above all else. If you remember, we talked a little bit about BS toward the end of our live session last time, where people are indifferent to the truth. That seems to be a particularly bad form of intellectual dishonesty. Now, I wanted to just remind ourselves about all of this because I got some bit of practical advice I'd like to just put forward right now. It just takes the form of 3 or 4 bits of things. So the first thing that I think we're going to want to really try to practice in this sort of class is a term people refer to as intellectual humility. And remember, one of the things you were asked to read for your Unit 2 last week was an article on intellectual, or at least excerpts from that article. And I thought that article was particularly valuable in showing that there's a difficulty in admitting when you don't know something, a difficulty in recognizing that you might be ignorant on a particular topic. And there are all sorts of things we're going to be studying in this class that are referred to as cognitive biases that prevent you from reasoning as well as you could, and that prevent you from even recognizing that you're failing to reason as well as you could. These are what are called implicit biases. A bias of this sort is implicit when you don't even realize you have the bias that you have. Lots and lots of the cognitive biases that impair our reasoning ability are implicit to the degree that we don't even recognize that we have them. We do. And so one general piece of advice to trying to be more intellectually honest is to try to remember that, like everyone else around you, you also have implicit biases. And I'm going to turn this personal, make this about me. I know I'm the teacher of this class. I'm not supposed to admit these sorts of faults or flaws, but I definitely have implicit biases. And one of the things I try to constantly remind myself is that my judgment, while from the inside might feel like it's perfectly reasonable and makes sense, is probably being influenced by these implicit biases that I don't realize I have. And so this in general makes me want to try to lower my confidence in my beliefs, lower my confidence in how reliable my judgment is when I'm trying to form my beliefs. When I think that when I feel really confident that I've gotten the correct answer on a particular claim, I should just lower my confidence a little bit because of my recognition of having these sorts of biases. That's one sort of piece of practical advice. You're going to see this popping up again and again and again in this class. Another piece of important advice is to avoid straw figuring arguments. So a type of fallacy we're going to be discussing later on this semester is called the straw figure fallacy, where you're oversimplifying or distorting somebody else's argument. particularly an argument towards a conclusion you disagree with. This is the sort of thing we want to try to actively fight against. It's a very common thing. And the discussion questions we're going to be doing this week and next week are going to be related to trying to practice avoiding figuring in this way. It can often be hard to just listen to people when they are disagreeing with you, when they're arguing towards a conclusion that you don't believe. And so because of this difficulty, we're going to try to practice this a lot. And our discussion questions this week and next week are designed to practice just that. Again, we'll talk about this more later in the live session. Rather than straw figuring, we should be doing the opposite of straw figuring, which is called steel figuring. Some of you might have heard this as straw manning and steel manning. I just use the term steel figure rather than man to avoid gendering these ideas. So the idea is we want to try to focus on the best versions of arguments that go against our beliefs. If somebody's disagreeing with us, rather than looking for reasons to think that they're wrong, rather than looking for reasons to think that that we have to shoot them down, what we should do instead is try to genuinely give them a chance and try to actually help them and try to put forward what we think of as the best versions of these arguments that go against us. So I'm going to use an example that I don't know if any of y'all heard of, but there are these arguments out there for and against the existence of God. And one particular type of argument that atheists like to mock for the existence of God is a particularly simplistic bad argument that says something along the lines of bananas were perfectly designed for humans to eat. The only way bananas could exist is if there is a God. So therefore, God exists because bananas exist. It's not a particularly great argument for the existence of God. And for some reason, sort of self-assured atheists out there in the world, people who don't think that there's a God, really liked to make fun of this type of argument when they saw it out in the world. And that might be the sort of thing you could do if all you care about as an atheist, let's say, is making fun of arguments you disagree with, oversimplifying arguments you disagree with. That's classic straw figuring, thinking that like the only arguments for the existence of God are banana arguments, as bad as this banana argument. But if you really care about the particular issue of whether there's a God or not, what you should be doing is not looking at the worst arguments for the conclusion you disagree with. You should be looking at the best arguments. And there are very sophisticated philosophical books out there, like this book on this particular slide called God and Other Minds by Alvin Plantinga, that try to put forward sophisticated reasons to believe that there is a God. And by the way, I'm not choosing this particular thing because I'm trying to advocate for you all to believe that there is a God. I want the same thing to happen if you believe in God. I don't want you to make fun of atheists and particularly bad arguments for atheism. I want you to try to look at the best arguments for atheism that are out there. I want you to try to challenge yourself in that way, to genuinely focus on the best versions of arguments that go against your beliefs, whatever those happen to be. All right, so that's another set of practical advice. Instead of straw figuring, try to steel figure. This is related to something called the principle of charity, which is this idea within logic that you should consider the best, strongest possible interpretations of every argument. You should be charitable towards people's arguments, particularly other people's arguments, most particularly arguments towards claims you initially disagree with. People refer to this as the principle of charity. It's related pretty strongly to this idea of steel figuring rather than straw figuring arguments. All right, there's this really nice thing from a podcast that I'd like to listen to with you collectively right now. A philosopher named Agnes Keller talks about how she loves when other people refute her. And refutation is like somebody coming up with an argument that explains why you are wrong. Refutation is this process of pointing out where you yourself are wrong. Most of the time, I feel like we would think to ourselves, we wouldn't like it if somebody points out that we are wrong. That doesn't feel like a particularly nice thing. But let's listen to Agnes Callard right now. Actually, I'm not sure I can do this way. Am I? I don't know if you're going to be able to listen to this. I just realized. Now I'm trying to think. Let me try to do it one more time. There. Yeah, I think if I share it this way, it winds up not working. Let me try real quickly to do it a different way. So hopefully you now see a second version of me. And what I'm going to do now is share in this window, which I think I'm going to be able to do. I don't have share permission. All right, never mind. All right, so what I'm going to do, instead of play this right now for you, I am going to post this on Blackboard after our live session today for y'all to listen to. So hopefully we'll get a better sense of it then. Sorry, I realized I just opened it in the wrong way, so it's frustrating. But anyway, what you would have seen or listened to is a really cool a really cool little, like, I don't know, monologue maybe on this sort of thing. So let me go back to sharing this way. Yeah, so Barbara, you're right. I was on student mode, and that's why it didn't work. And I'm just, for the sake of simplicity, I'm not gonna do full sharing of this at this particular time. So anyway, not too big a deal. So the last piece of practical advice I want to talk about is open-mindedness in general. This is something that you probably heard a ton in terms of general practical advice, but I just want to hammer home this idea because this is one of those that's very much easier said than done, the idea of being genuinely open-minded. So open-mindedness is this willingness to genuinely listen to people you disagree with in this sort of open way, not listening to just dismiss, not listening to say, like, I'm waiting for my turn to speak, but listening in that open way that suggests, I will change my mind. I will learn and grow from this conversation, at least if warranted. If somebody presents me with evidence that allows me to change my mind, I should be open to that. And that cartoon from the oatmeal that we read in our first week of class is designed to show you how our brain goes into overdrive trying to shut down this open-mindedness in us, trying to get us closed-minded in a very stubborn, narrow, wooden-headed way. So it takes a lot of effort, a lot of practice and training to get to the point where we are open-minded enough to genuinely listen to other people. So a lot of what we're going to be practicing over these first weeks of the semester are skills of listening, skills of openness. And the discussion boards this week and next week in particular are designed for exactly that. Awesome. So that's the end of what I wanted to discuss just in regards to the practical advice. It sort of ends what we were talking about last week in our Unit 2 session. Now what I would like to do is switch over to start talking about the big topics of today's live session. That is the core of logic. Then the core of logic I think of as arguments. So I've got a slideshow for y'all. Excited for this slideshow. Let's see if I can pitch it so that you can see it as a slideshow. Yeah. Nice. All right. So I think of arguments, we've already talked about them a bunch, as a really crucial aspect to logic in general. And when I think of how we use arguments, I break down the idea of logic into 3 different steps. When it comes to arguments, you want to try to understand people's arguments. When it comes to arguments, you then want to try to evaluate those arguments, figure out whether they're good arguments or bad arguments. And then ultimately, you want to try to develop your own arguments in support of some sort of position. For the first part of today's live session, we're going to be talking about understanding arguments. The second part, we'll be discussing evaluating arguments. But right now, we're just going to focus on this understanding stage. So an argument, as we talk about it in this class, is just a main point along with reasons that are supposed to provide evidence that that main point is correct. So in this context, we refer to a main point as our conclusion. We have the conclusion of an argument, the main point you're trying to prove, and then our reasons we refer to as premises. A single piece of evidence is a premise. Multiple pieces of evidence are premises. And the premises are supposed to prove the conclusion. That's what we mean by argument in this class. So there are tons of different definitions of the word argument, like some people talk about arguments as like a fight between a couple people or a back and forth debate. And those are totally acceptable versions of the word argument. They're just different definitions. The type of argument we have in mind in this class is this: a main point backed up by reasons, or a claim backed up by evidence. Anytime somebody says something and then tries to justify what they just said by offering evidence, they are presenting an argument. What we'll be doing for the first part of this live session right now is getting clearer on how we understand these sorts of arguments. So Monique asks in the chat, is this similar to confirmation bias? And there was disconfirmation bias. I also know of something separate as desirability bias, but there's something related to this, and we'll be talking about both of those biases later on in the semester. But just at this particular point, we're not talking about what you accept or don't accept. We're talking about some sort of claim that you back up with your evidence. So the confirmation bias is the tendency to accept a claim just because it sort of like looks like claims you already believe. It sort of fits with your worldview already. So that's you accepting a claim without checking the evidence that backs it up. That's what confirmation bias is all about. So there is some sort of overlap, but arguments at this part are at the much more basic level of just any old claim backed up by any old evidence. So in your own life, you've probably, since Kane has started up its fall semester, you've probably heard dozens of different arguments, either watching TV or talking to your friends and family. You've probably heard a bunch of people not only say a claim, but put their claim with evidence. You've probably put forward dozens of arguments yourself. You've often said something and then backed it up with some evidence. This is a very common way to talk in the regular world. So what I want to do is give you all a chance to just provide some examples of arguments. I'm going to start with my own example of an argument right now, but I want all of you to think of your own examples, because I want to just hear from a bunch of you so we get a chance to practice listening to arguments and then trying to understand those arguments. I'm going to start with a particular argument right now that's about my book bag. So there's a photo of my book bag right now. And I want to say in general that I really like my book bag. But my bag has one and only one flaw in it. And that is that little like shoulder strap pad you see at the very top of that photo is a little bit ripped. The sort of sewing and stitching has sort of come off a little bit. And that's the only flaw to my bag. Otherwise, I was really excited when I bought this. I really like it. I think there's something really nice about it. This is the only flaw that my bag has. And I know that this is a really easy fix. All I have to do, and I know how to sew, is just sew this up. And then my bag will once again be flawless. This sort of rip has just started a little bit. It's not so bad, but it's the only flaw that the bag has. And it's super easy to fix. So it's pretty clear that I should fix this bag. I know I haven't yet, but I should fix this bag. So what I just did is I presented an argument to you all. What do you think was the conclusion to my argument? What was the main point I was trying to convince you or myself to believe? So Shantae nailed it. In the chat, Shantae wrote, I should fix the bag. Absolutely, that's the conclusion. I should fix my bag's strap pad, shoulder strap pad. What was one premise in that argument? What was one of my reasons in support of this conclusion? Think about the premises in this argument. What were the premises? All right, Facundo says it was flawless before or aside from this. Franco's actually saying something a little bit different. I don't think I ever mentioned me selling this bag at a higher price. I feel like Franco's just giving me different advice about this bag. And Isabel mentions that I like everything about this bag except this one flaw, right? That it's a nice bag aside from this one flaw. And then Amanda and Barbara got this other aspect of this argument. The other premise is that it's an easy fix. I know how to sew. I should be able to fix this pretty easily, right? So these are all really good ways to understand this argument. My bag's only flaw is this pad. The pad is easy to fix. Therefore, I should fix my bag's strap pad. If I wanted to write this in formal notation, this is exactly what I would write. I would write my premises first, and I would write my conclusion last. Now, Isabel brought up a really interesting question, kind of like what Franco was doing, where Franco was sort of saying like, oh, here's another solution. Isabel says, isn't it possible to like a flaw? What you're doing in this case, Isabel, is evaluating this argument. You're at the next step already. All we're trying to do at this particular stage is understand the argument. All I was asking was, what's the conclusion of the argument and what are the premises? You might be very correct in saying this argument is not a good argument. There might be reasons to think that this argument itself is not so great. But in terms of understanding the argument, all we have to do is figure out what are the premises and what is the conclusion. And that's separate entirely from whether the argument's a good argument or a bad argument. Our first step is always to understand before we evaluate. That's a really good and important order of doing things. One of the things that we're going to be discussing in this class, and I might as well start discussing it now, is how often get into problems when we jump to evaluating first and foremost before we understand what somebody else is saying. Oftentimes we get in trouble thinking we understand somebody else's argument and then putting forward criticism only to realize we did not understand their argument. Our criticism doesn't apply. That is straw figuring, what we talked about maybe, 5-10 minutes ago. Straw figuring other people's arguments is misrepresenting their arguments, oversimplifying somebody else's arguments. So an important, really crucial first step is that understanding stage. So in this particular case, here's how we write our arguments in nice neat formal notation. I like to label all of my premises with the letter P. And this isn't just me, this is a somewhat common notation. And I number my premises. P1 for the first premise, P2 for the second premise. If there were 3 or 4 or 5 premises, we would add a P3 and a P4 and a P5. However many premises you are, you can just keep listing them and numbering them. And then when I'm done writing all of my premises out, I like to draw a line, a vertical line, separating my premises from my conclusion. A horizontal line. I always have to think about what's vertical and what's horizontal. I like to draw a horizontal line separating my premises from my conclusion, and then write out the conclusion, labeling it with the letter C for conclusion. And notice in this case, you don't have to number your conclusions, because in an argument, there's always only going to be one single main conclusion. All right, so this is a general notation. So I want you all now to come up with your own examples of arguments. Say an argument that's kind of like my bag argument. Give me an argument for why you like something. Give me an argument that's like interesting and controversial or boring. Give me an argument that you don't even believe. Put forward some sort of claim, back it up with some evidence, and then the rest of us are going to try to understand that argument. Somebody give us an example of an argument right now. Put forward some sort of argument. You can either raise your hand and unmute yourself, or you can write your argument in the chat. The only thing I want you to do is not label your premises and conclusion in this argument. Let us try to figure out what part of your argument is the conclusion and what parts are the premises. Who's got an argument? Tell us an argument. All right. So Monique's starting us out. That water isn't wet. Remember, an argument isn't just one sentence. An argument is at least a conclusion and at least one premise. So you owe us a little bit more, Monique. You've given us, the very least, a bold claim, but you want to now either back up that bold claim or use that bold claim as evidence to conclude something else. So let's say you want to argue water isn't wet. What would be your argument for that conclusion that water isn't wet? And I like that Onell's sort of scared about this one. This is a topic that has broken the internet, right? Water isn't wet versus water is wet debate. I've seen very smart people get very, very angry about this particular topic. So Denzel says water is wet only when you touch it. All right, so the important thing about this is that what Monique is doing is a different type of argument. Monique is not presenting us with a claim and backing it up with evidence. Monique's presenting us with a controversial claim that people would then argue about, right? A contentious topic. And that's a different use of the word argument. Remember, going back to our definition of an argument here, this is the definition of argument we have in mind in this class. A main point backed up with some reasons. A conclusion and premises that are logically supporting it. Arguments of the other sort, back and forth debates, fights, competitions, it's not the sort of argument we're talking about in this class right now. So let's think about other things. All right, so Monique says, as to add on to her water isn't wet argument, water isn't wet. Water is liquid, so it makes things wet, but water itself isn't wet. Excellent. So with Monique's argument, what's the conclusion? What's her main point? What is she trying to get us to believe in this argument? Yeah, absolutely, Barbara. Water isn't wet is the conclusion. Isabel, nice job as well. What is a premise in her argument? What is one piece of evidence she's putting forward in this argument? Water isn't wet. Water is liquid, so it makes things wet, but water itself isn't wet. What do you think? What's a piece of evidence? What's a premise in that set of sentences? Isabel says, water makes other things wet. Yeah, and there's a distinction, right, between making other things wet and yourself being wet. Yeah. And as Olivia sort of spells it out in more detail, right, Isabel did a nice job of just highlighting exactly what Monique said, but Olivia seems to be saying an expansion of that. Only if water touches something, then that object is wet. And as Isabel says here, water makes things wet. And that maybe there's this hidden premise, something that makes things wet itself isn't wet. So that's an excellent way of sort of describing this in this particular case. If you have the property of wet making, that is making other things wet, that doesn't mean you yourself are wet. Yeah, interesting, nice, good. I like this. And Franco asking a really nice foundational question in the chat here. How does the first person know that water is wet? Yeah, we've got you got a future in stand-up comedy with that premise there. Very nice. Awesome. So here's the key skill we're trying to develop right now. When we listen to arguments or read arguments, we basically want to, at the first stage of things, figure out which part of an argument is the conclusion and which parts are the premises, and then which parts are neither, right? I said a lot of stuff in my bag argument that were neither a conclusion or a premise, so you're able to like figure that out. And this is the key skill that I want us to continue developing in class today and also throughout the rest of the semester. This is not just a one-day activity. We're going to continue to do this throughout the rest of the semester. Also, we're going to talk about lots of different types of arguments. So at a more advanced level of understanding arguments, it's important to know what different types of arguments exist out there and to know which way to slot those different arguments. We're learning about deductive arguments, inductive arguments, abductive arguments, arguments by analogy, causal arguments, arguments from authority. We're learning tons of different types of arguments here. And it's important to know, especially when it comes time to evaluate those arguments, what type of argument we're dealing with, because we evaluate different arguments in slightly different ways depending on what type of arguments they are. Now, we're not learning those different types of arguments today. Those are going to happen over the next like 5 or 6 weeks. We're just going to take like a different argument each unit and run through 1 or 2 of them over the next 5 or 6 weeks. But for today, we're going to continue practicing this first thing. So here's another argument that I've just written out in regular, just like sentence form. I want us to figure out for this argument, what's the conclusion? The argument is Stuart must be yellow because all minions are yellow, and Stuart definitely is a minion. So I want you to try to figure out what part of this argument is the conclusion. And then I want you to ask a little follow-up question. How were you able to tell that that particular part of the argument was the conclusion and the other parts were premises? I'm going to do this as a poll right now. And I'm almost ready to set it up. There it is. It should have popped up to you as a poll. I want you to vote on which part of this argument you think the conclusion is. Your three options are Stuart is yellow, all minions are yellow. Your third option, Stuart is a minion. I got people voting in the poll right now. I'll give you some updates as it happens. I got 4 votes for Stuart is yellow. I got 1 vote for all minions are yellow. And I got 10 votes for Stuart is a minion. Up to 5 votes for Stuart is yellow. Up to 11 votes for Stuart is a minion. I'm up to 2 votes for all minions are yellow. I now got 7 votes for Stuart is yellow, 3 votes for all minions are yellow, 10 votes for Stuart is a minion. If you've already locked in your vote, think about why you voted the way you voted. What is it about this argument that made you pick this part as the main point, the conclusion, and the other parts as the premises? All right, we've got almost everybody responding at this point, everybody except 3 of us, so I'm going to show the results. We got 9 people who voted for Stuart is yellow, 2 people for all minions are yellow, and 11 of us voted for Stuart is a minion. So we've got basically 2 popular competing options, either the first part or the last part. Got a few people who voted for the middle part, but it looks like people are mostly torn between the first sentence or the last sentence in this argument. Well, I'm just going to tell you what I think the answer is, and then we can sort of talk through it. And in talking through why I think that's the answer, we're going to see how I want us to understand the question, what is the conclusion of the argument? We're going to try to get a better sense of that. So I think this first part, Stuart must be yellow, is the conclusion. I think that's the part that is our conclusion for sure. And if I were to write this out in nice, neat formal notation, like we just did, I would write out premise 1. All minions are yellow. Premise 2, Stuart is a minion. Therefore, conclusion, Stuart is yellow. So Monique asked in the chat, is there a right or a wrong answer? When we frame the question, what's the conclusion of an argument, in the proper way, the way we're going to talk about it in this class, there is, in fact, a right answer. And there are, in fact, wrong answers. But it depends on having the correct understanding of the question, what is the conclusion? That question is often misinterpreted or not interpreted in the way that we're going to understand it in this particular class. So approximately half of you got this particular answer. Stuart must be yellow is the conclusion. How were you able to tell that that part of the argument was the conclusion? What was it about this argument that made you say, first part conclusion, next 2 parts premises? What made you pick that particular choice? So Monique says there's something about the word must in this argument. So tell me more. What is it about this word must that makes you think that there's something important going on here? I'm going to highlight it. Boom. Well, can I do it like this so it stays there? There we go. Now you can see it. So what is it about this word must? And Isabel also says there's something about the wording. Yeah. What does the word must mean in this context? What is it about the wording of this argument that makes you pick out this first bit as the conclusion? How are you interpreting this word must in this particular context? I think you're on to something, Monique. Somebody, either Monique or someone else, tell us what you mean by this. So Isabel in the chat says, must means that it follows from the rest of what's being said. Yeah, this feels like somebody is a really boring detective in this argument, right? And somebody has been given 2 very simple facts. All minions are yellow. Stuart definitely is a minion. And this detective has figured out, well, if all minions are yellow and Stuart's a minion, aha, here's what must be true. Stuart must be yellow. It's a very easy conclusion to draw, right? But this particular person putting forward this argument has figured it out. And that must is like a logical, I've just figured out what must also logically follow. Conclusions are the sort of things that are supposed to logically follow from their premises. So absolutely, right? Very well put, Monique and Isabel. Isabel, our other Isabel, we've got two Isabels in this class. I'm not sure how to disambiguate us because I'm not a big fan of saying last names, so I don't like to give your full names. But a different Isabel in the chat says, it seems like it has to be that way, like there's no other options. And yeah, that's how this sort of must is interpreted in this case. The premises, all minions are yellow, Stuart is a minion, has made it so that there's no other possible option other than Stuart must be yellow, right? There's something along the lines of that. Isabel also mentioned earlier in the chat that there's something about just the wording in general. We've got the word must. Is there anything else about the wording of this argument that seems to stick out to you that suggests, oh yeah, this part's the conclusion, these parts are the premises? Is there any other part of this argument, any other wording in this argument that's sticking out to you? I'm asking a leading question. The answer should be yes. So really I should be asking, what other words in this argument seems to be helpful, seems to be doing a lot of work towards figuring out that this first part is our conclusion? So Monique says the word because and the word definitely. Barbara also mentions the word definitely. Isabel says the word all minions, or I guess the phrase all minions. Leah says the word because. So we got a couple votes for because in this particular case. I do think there's something about the word because. What do you think the word because means in this argument? I feel like the more I say the word, the less it feels like a word. So I'm going to stop saying it. But what does that B word mean? Denzel, go ahead and unmute yourself.
It's like the final conclusion.
Yeah, so when you say because, you're trying to say, like, I'm giving you evidence towards my final conclusion, right? Olivia's in the chat also said, like, you're presenting evidence, right? You're saying, like, I'm concluding something, Stuart is yellow. And you want to know why I'm concluding it? Because of this, because of this, because of this. I'm concluding that Stuart's yellow because all minions are yellow. I'm concluding that Stuart's yellow because Stuart's a minion. These are my reasons. These are my evidence why I believe this particular conclusion. So I think that word because is doing a ton of work in this argument to let us know that the second two sentences are premises and the first sentence in this argument is the conclusion. I think the word must is also doing it, but for me, the biggest word in this argument is the word because. And this is how I want us to understand the question, what's the conclusion of an argument? How do we determine the premises of an argument? How do we determine the conclusion of an argument? What we're really trying to do is figuring out the author's intention in putting forward an argument. What is the author of the argument trying to tell us her conclusion is? What is the author of the argument trying to tell us the premises of the argument are? And that's an important way of understanding this question. So I'm going to eliminate that broader question and say anytime we're trying to understand an argument, we're trying to understand somebody's efforts to communicate with us. A particular person who's written the argument, who said the argument, is trying to communicate with us their argument. And we should be trying to figure that out. The answer to this question, how do we figure out anybody's intentions? How do we figure out author's intentions, the meanings of words or anything, is the context. We look at the context in which an argument exists. So I'm going to give you a real dumb example right now in the chat of you trying to understand something without any context. I'm just going to give you a word without any context at all. Do you know what type of bat I'm thinking of when I just wrote the word bat in the chat without any context surrounding it? Think about all the different types of bats there are, right? No, right? You don't know which type of bat I mean. But what if I add the following word next to bat? I just gave you a little bit of context. So Shanae still doesn't know what type of bat I have in mind? What type of bat do the rest of y'all think I know I'm talking about when I say twilight bat? Okay, so even at this point, Isabel says you can make a guess, but you might not feel particularly confident. Facundo is making a guess in one particular direction, right? Vampire bat, as Barbara's talking about, maybe an animal type of bat, right? So how about I give you a full sentence? In Twilight, Edward turned into a bat. Now I give you a full sentence. Do you know what the word bat means in that context? Yeah. So you see how words are understood in their context in this sort of way. So for those of you who might not be familiar, Twilight is a series of novels that were also turned into a series of movies in which one of the main characters is a vampire. Vampires are the sorts of fictional creatures who can turn into bats when being sort of like sometimes in human-like form, sometimes in bat-like form. And by bats, we mean the animal bats, the ones with wings that flap around in the night, that sort of bat. So this is how we understand the meaning of words in general. The same thing happens when we're trying to understand the meanings of an argument and when we're trying to understand the different parts of an argument. Here is the Stewart minions argument we just said. Here are all the sentences that make up the argument. Stewart's yellow, all minions are yellow, Stewart's a minion. If I just gave you those sentences without any context, I didn't use words like because, I didn't use words like and, you would not know what the author of the argument thinks is her conclusion. As Isabel mentioned in the chat, you could guess, but you couldn't feel that confident, right? Absent context, you couldn't figure out the conclusion. But once you've got these context words, the word because, and in this case the word and, extending the word because not only to the second sentence, but also that because extends to the third sentence, we now know that the words, the second sentence and the third sentence are premises. The word because is indicating to us that premises are about to be given. And what comes before the word because is a conclusion. So we've got all sorts of words and phrases that indicate to us here comes a premise or here comes a conclusion. And we refer to these as premise indicators or conclusion indicators. What are some words or phrases y'all can think of that indicate to us here comes a premise or here comes a conclusion? We already got the word because on the premise side. What are some other words or phrases that are like that? Think about words or phrases you use in your everyday life that means like, I'm about to give you my main points. I'm about to conclude something. Or words or phrases that let you know, I'm about to give you some evidence. Here comes some reasons. What are some words or phrases y'all can think of? So Barbara's got a nice one. The word since. I think that's a great one. Absolutely. I'm going to go over here to since. What else we got? Isabel's got a really nice one on the conclusion indicator side. Therefore, absolutely. Yeah. So let me do this. Therefore, absolutely. Nice. Other ones y'all can think of. So, as a result, really nice ones on the conclusion side. For that reason, absolutely, right? These are all good ones. Y'all are doing them too fast for me to get them. As a result, for that reason, we're pointing backwards, you listing reasons. Pointing forward, you're now going to conclude something from that. Yes, nice, excellent. Hence is a really nice one, Barbara. Awesome. I'm too lazy, I'm going to stop writing them now. For the following reasons is another awesome one, Leah. Facundo asked a question in here. So would it still be an argument if these premise indicators or conclusion indicators aren't present? The answer is yes. And that's mainly because arguments, authors are sometimes not the best at explaining their argument. Not every argument has context. Sometimes when people put forward an argument, they eliminate their context clues. They might not use the word because. They might not use the word therefore. the participation activity I'm going to be asking you to do for class this week, ask you to circle any premise indicators and circle any conclusion indicators. Some of the arguments on that worksheet don't contain any indicators at all. And that's frustrating. That makes it a lot harder for us to figure out which part of the argument is the conclusion and which parts are the premises. So one general tip I say, just as a writing tip, if you're writing an argument, or even just like a speaking tip, if you're saying an argument, it's helpful to use these indicators as nice context clues for the person you're communicating with. Use these sorts of words of the sort you just had. And I've got a list. This is not exhaustive, but look at how many of the ones that y'all just came up with as nice examples of premise indicators and conclusion indicators. Y'all got since, y'all got for the following reasons, y'all got therefore, hence, as a result, so. There are a couple others on here. There are also ones that I haven't listed here. These aren't exhaustive lists. There are definitely more premise indicators out there than these 4. There are definitely more conclusion indicators out there than these 6. There are lots and lots more, but that's just a start. Awesome. Monique in the chat asks, isn't it hard arguing or refuting with somebody that doesn't have a conclusion or know what they're trying to conclude themselves? Yeah, so I agree with this, Monique. If somebody is not clear on what the point is that they're trying to make, it can be difficult to have a conversation with that particular person. Getting that sort of clarity in that back and forth disagreement, and for what it's worth, by the way, I'm going to refer to the sorts of arguments that you're talking about, those sort of debate style arguments, as disagreements. When 2 people are talking about a topic and they disagree on the topic, I'm going to refer to those as disagreements rather than arguments, mainly because I want us to be clear on what we mean by argument in this class. And an argument this class would mean somebody putting forward a conclusion and backing it up with evidence. The sort of disagreements you're talking about can be tricky, right? If somebody doesn't know their conclusion, then how do you even have a conversation with them if they don't understand what their conclusion is? Yeah, it can be for sure challenging. Now, one thing I will say, though, is that when it comes time to another person interacting with a clear argument that you're putting forward, let's say I put forward an argument very clearly, somebody can come along and really productively disagree with me by criticizing my argument, even if they don't have a definitive conclusion themselves. They might not be able to say, here's my argument for why your conclusion is wrong. What they could instead say is, here is a criticism of your argument that shows your argument for your conclusion is not so great. That can sometimes be effective, and that can be a helpful way to actually learn and grow. All right, all those nice caveats. I really like the question, Monique. In general, here's what we're going to be doing when we try to develop our skill of argumentation in this class. We're first going to try to understand. We'll be doing readings in this class that are specifically just containing arguments, where we try to figure out the main point of what that particular article is all about and figure out the reasons offered in support of this point. About half of our class is devoted to the understanding stage of arguments. Anytime we introduce a new type of argument, like an inductive argument or a causal argument, we're going to first try to understand those arguments. And then we'll turn and do other stuff like evaluating arguments. Our goal in class is to get better and better and better at finding arguments in the wild that we read in newspapers or magazines, that people tell us, that we find on Facebook, etc. And we're going to try to be able to develop that skill of converting what it is we've interacted with into nice, neat, formal premise conclusion arguments. That's going to be a key bit. And this is the thing I'm asking you to do for your Unit 3 participation activity. I want you to, for each one of the arguments, numbers 1 through 8, on the first page of this participation activity, circle any premise indicators or conclusion indicators. Words like because, words like therefore, words like since, words like hence, words like as a result, words like due to, all those sorts of words or phrases. And then I want you to underline the conclusion, figuring out what you think the main point is. I'm going to address Facundo's question first, and then I'm going to call on Shanae second. In the chat, Facundo asked, would the conclusion be impacted depending on where in the argument it is presented? So yeah, this is a really good question. And this gets us to another fascinating thing about language. The word bat has so many different meanings. The word argument has a bunch of different meanings. The word conclusion has a bunch of different meanings as well. And the word conclusion in the context of an argument just means the main point. It's not another definition of argument, which is like the last thing in a sequence of things. So a conclusion of an argument can be right at the top. It could be the first thing you say. A conclusion of an argument could be the last thing you say. But a conclusion of an argument could be somewhere in the middle of all the things that you say. It doesn't matter where the conclusion is in an argument. What matters is that the context of that argument makes it clear that this sentence is the main point and the other sentences are premises. So that's a really good point, Facundo. In the context of this class, conclusion doesn't mean the end, the last thing said, the final step in a sequence of steps. It's not the conclusion of a movie. It's not the conclusion of a book. We're talking about the conclusion of an argument, and that could happen at the start. That could happen in the middle. That could happen anywhere. All right, Shanae, your hand was also up. Why don't you unmute yourself and tell us what was on your mind?
So what we do is we download the document to a computer and then we circle it from there.
Yeah, so you can do it any number of ways. This is the first participation activity that has a worksheet associated with it. So there are a variety of different ways you can do it. So here's one way that I'm going to do it, just because I happen to have, I've downloaded Adobe Acrobat as a PDF reader. I open this up as a PDF right here, and then I can like highlight things and underline things. So like instead of circling things, I could have highlighted the word because. And then instead, I could actually underline, we must restrict protesters here. One of the options I have is underline. I guess you can't see it, but like I can do it for another one. Like let's say I thought this first sentence here was the conclusion. I can underline that one. You can sort of see that it's underlined. That's one way you could do it. Then you could save it and then upload what you save as a PDF. Here's another way that you could submit this on Blackboard, and that's what I'm going to be asking you to do. I want you to submit these participation activities on Blackboard. You can, if you have access to a printer, print out this participation activity, write your, actually do your circling and underlining on this, and then take a photo of what it is you've done, and then submit your photos on Blackboard. Or if you have access to a scanner, you could scan in your results and then submit your scanned PDF. If you don't have access to a printer, you don't want to mess with Adobe Acrobat Reader and manipulate this, you can just write your answers on a separate Google document. Yeah, as Isabel says, you might have to like work on your skills, but like you could use Microsoft Paint or one of those that just like you're able to draw on your screen type of things. But like a simple way to do this would be like create a separate Google document or a Word document, and then just write your answers down. So like for answer number 1, you could write one indicator is because, and then the conclusion is we must restrict protesters. Then you do that for number 2, list the indicators, list the conclusion. Do that for number 3, list the indicators, list the conclusion. I know all the arguments. You don't have to submit the whole worksheet. You can submit your answers. That's totally fine. Whatever works for you. If you don't have access to Microsoft Word, if you don't have access to a Word document, and you want to just write out your answers on a piece of paper and then take a photo of the answers you write down and submit that, I'll accept that too. I'm not picky, however it is you want to do this. So let's actually practice this a little bit right now. I'm going to delete that because that's not right. Why don't we do, let's do argument number 2 on this. I'm going to make it so that we can only see argument number 2 right here. So argument number 2 says, people should be held accountable for their own behavior. And if holding people accountable for their own behavior entails capital punishment, then so be it. However, no person should be held accountable for behavior over which he or she had no control. Thus, people who cannot control their behavior should not be given the death penalty. So remember, we got to do 2 things. Circle any indicators, premise indicators or conclusion indicators, and then underline the conclusion. Let's do some circling first. What are some premise indicators or conclusion indicators in this argument? Are there any? What would you say is a premise indicator or a conclusion indicator? So Shanae says the word thus and also the word however. Isabel also says the word however. All right. Any of the rest of you want to co-sign these? Also say thus, also say however, or add a third one? Cool. So Isabel says the word if, and William says then so, right here. We got lots of possibilities. Cool. All right. So one thing in general I will say about these sorts of arguments is that often the arguments have roughly one indicator. So the fact that we have 4 of them listed is probably overkill. It's probably a lot and maybe too many. And I like that we have too many because this is going to be instructive to talk about words that don't fit nice and neatly into the premise indicator box or the conclusion indicator box. So some of these probably won't work, which is nice. Most arguments have 1 or maybe 2, if the author's being generous, types of indicators. Some arguments on this worksheet have literally 0, just to be on the heads up. Sometimes you won't have to circle anything. You'll just have to underline something on here. But let's take a look at any of these. Are any of these 4 ones, if, then so, however, thus, on our list of approved premise indicators or approved conclusion indicators, ones that we saw on our slideshow, ones that we mentioned earlier in class? Any of these definitely on the list? Barbara says, however. Did we discuss the word however? I don't remember that being on our slideshow. Was the word however on our slides? So Facundo and Leah says the word thus definitely was on our slides. And I'm looking at our slides right now. The word thus was in fact on our slideshow. Thus was listed as one of our conclusion indicators. So I would be pretty confident with thus for sure. And in fact, I think thus definitely is. Now, a bunch of you are feeling somewhat confident about the word however. So let's talk about that one next. Oh, so Shanae says, can I go back to it? Absolutely. Why don't we just go back to it right now? One thing I want to remind you of is that you can always take a look at these slides yourself because they're always posted in the on Blackboard in whatever unit we're using them for. So going back to the slides, here are the ones that I put on my slide. Thus is on the conclusion one right here. Blah, 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 blah. Not one of the ones we came up with, but it is definitely one. It's a pretty popular conclusion indicator. Cool. All right, so going back now to our participation activity. Let's talk about this word, however, now. What does the word however mean? Notice however was not one of our officially approved conclusion indicators or premise indicators. When you hear the word however, what does that mean to you? What do you associate with the word however? Because remember, conclusion indicator is about trying to say, here's my main point. Premise indicator is trying to say, here comes some evidence. Yeah, so I really like what y'all are saying in the chat here. You're saying that however is kind of like a contrast word. It's a synonym to the word but. They basically mean the same thing. But, however, although, on the on the other hand, in contrast, all of those sorts of words or phrases mean the same thing. And as Monique says, you're saying you're allowing another perspective. You're saying, I just said one thing, but now I'm going to say something that's different from this first thing I said. You might say something of the sort like this. It's weird. I really like ice cream, but I don't like most other cold things. Something on the lines of that. I like ice cream, but I don't like cold food in general. Something along the lines of that is like a contrast. So if you're being given a word that says, here comes something contrasting, do you know whether what's coming next is going to be a contrasting main point? Do you know whether what's coming next is going to be a contrasting piece of evidence? And in general, the answer is no. Just from the word however on its own, we don't know that. So I would say in this particular case, the word however is not an indicator. And I think in general, the words however, and also words like but or although, and all those other sorts of words aren't premise indicators or conclusion indicators. They indicate something else, but they don't indicate a main point or evidence. All right, how about the word if? And now this is interesting. If as a word oftentimes gets associated with the word then. We did have the word then, so be it. So maybe I should actually split this up into two different words, the word then and the word so. If-then sentences are pretty common. They're called conditional sentences. You say something of the following sort. If it's snowing, then it's cold outside. Something along the lines of that. You're saying some sort of necessary and sufficient condition type of relationship in that. What do you think about that type of sentence? If-then as a sentence means not that this if part definitely is happening, but that there's some connection between the if part of your sentence and the then part. If the if part is happening, then the then part also must be happening, right? If snow is happening, then coldness must also be happening. If it snows, then it has to be cold, is a standard thing. I'm not saying it actually is snowing right now. It's not snowing. It's a very nice, like, fall weather outside right now. No snow on the ground, at least in New Jersey. But that if is saying in those cases it is snowing, then we'll definitely have coldness. There's that sort of connection. Ira mentions that the connections coming in and out for her. Is that for the rest of you as well? This might be on my end, or maybe it's just on Iris' connection end. I'm not sure. Let me know whether the connection is good or bad for you, everybody in the chat. So if-then sentences are the sort that you see in arguments all the time. Barbara says her connection's fine. If-then sentences exist in all places of an argument. You could see an if-then sentence as a premise. You could see an if-then sentence as a conclusion. They will exist in either place. So just seeing the words if-then in an argument isn't enough to get you definitively to know whether you're dealing with a premise or a conclusion. So I wouldn't use if-then as an indicator either. I think that one isn't informative enough to let us go one way or the other. So Facundo asks in the chat, what happens if an argument is missing one of the two elements, either a premise indicator but no conclusion indicator, or vice versa? The answer is that's fine. Some arguments only have one of those indicators, only a conclusion indicator. Some arguments only have a premise indicator. Our Stuart the Minions argument only had a premise indicator. It only had the word because, and that's it. That was the only word that was any sort of indicator whatsoever. And that's going to be really common. And from context, you're going to have to figure out, this is the premise indicator. Let's say there's only one premise indicator. I guess anything that doesn't have an indication is going to be the conclusion. Right? And Monique asked, does that make it a bad argument? We haven't talked about evaluating arguments yet. We're just talking about understanding arguments. So you're getting ahead, which is nice. The answer is not exactly. By the standards that we care about, that wouldn't be a bad logical argument, like a logically bad argument. It might be an argument that's somewhat unclear, and you could make it clearer, but I think even if there's only one indicator, that can be fully clear. If an argument only has a conclusion indicator, it can still be perfectly clear what the conclusion of the argument is and what the premises are. If an argument has 0 indicators, then it might be a little bit lacking in clarity, but even then, you can sometimes just figure out from the context of how the sentences relate to each other what's going on. All right, the last one we want to talk about is this word so. Have we seen the word so before as one of our indicators? Does that exist on our slideshow? Shantae says yes, and it did, right? It existed on the conclusion side as a conclusion indicator, right? Somebody might say, Stuart's a minion, all minions are yellow, so Stuart is yellow. That so is that nice indicator. So I'm concluding from all of the things I just said, Stuart is yellow. We could definitely use the word so as a conclusion indicator in that particular way. What do you think about the word so in this context? What does the word so mean right here? Does so sound like we're drawing some sort of conclusion? Yeah, as Monique says, is like we're saying like, well, it is what it is. Well, if that's the consequence, then that's the consequence, right? If that's what it entails, then that's what it entails, right? That's the sort of like so be it you've maybe heard as a phrase. Now, we're introducing all sorts of frustrating wrinkles throughout all of this. And remember, this is just the first one we're checking out. The word so has a bunch of different definitions. Let's go ahead and just look up a dictionary style definition of the word so together, just to show you how dumb and complicated this whole world is. So we've got a bunch of different definitions there. I'm going to go to Merriam-Webster. I've got 1, A, B, C, D, 2, A, B, C, D, E. We're up to 9 different definitions of so far. 3, we've got 10 different definitions. Now as a conjunction, A, B, 2, 3, A, B. We're up to what, 17 different at this point? Now there's so as an adjective. So we've got 1, 2, 3 for so as an adjective. We're up to 20. So as a pronoun, so as a noun. There are, not to be a pun about this, so many different definitions of the word so. So this is another frustrating thing about the English language. There is a clear context in which the word so is a conclusion indicator. Absolutely, entirely clear. But in this particular case, I don't think the word so in this context is one of those definitions. I think this so is more like the Monique's it is what it is type of ones. So I don't think that's particularly helpful. In other words, and just to finally wrap up all of this, I think the final resting point for this particular argument is that we've got one indicator. Just like Facundo worried about earlier, we've got an argument that only has one indicator, just the word thus. But you know what? Oftentimes that is absolutely enough for us to figure out the argument from it. And in this case, now we're going to move on to figure out what we should underline. Based off of this indicator, what sentence do you think we should underline as the conclusion? Do you think we should underline the first sentence or part of the first sentence? Do you think we should underline the second sentence? Do you think we should underline the third and last sentence? What do you think we should go with? That final third sentence, that second sentence, or that first sentence? What do you think is our conclusion? All right, so Facundo's going with the last sentence. What do the rest of y'all think? It's this part. People who cannot control their behavior should not be given the death penalty. Shantae agrees. All right. Oh, so Franco goes with the first part. Iris also goes with the first part. Let's think a little bit about this now. Good, we've got a little debate here. So one of the things we've been trying to emphasize and stress in this particular case is that indicators are really helpful to us. Words like thus and other sorts of words are particularly helpful for figuring out what part of the argument is the conclusion and what parts are premises. And we label thus as a very clear indicator. Thus is a conclusion indicator. If we're going to trust this particular indicator, what should we draw as our conclusion? What should we is the conclusion if the word thus is a conclusion indicator? I think it's pretty clearly the sentence after the word thus is probably the conclusion. Now, there are definitely some sort of exceptions to this, but in this particular case, I think this last sentence in this argument is our conclusion. So I would not circle this, or I would not underline this first part of the first sentence. I think it's the last sentence, as Helen says in the chat. And by the way, one of the things that makes this argument tricky is that this first part of the argument feels like a conclusion, right? It feels like you would be asked to write on some standardized test an essay about this particular sentence. Should people be held accountable for their own behavior? In a 5-paragraph essay, please explain and defend your stance on this particular claim. Right? That feels conclusion-y in general, but in the context of this argument, it's very clear the author of this argument, who uses the word thus, thinks of this as a premise. The first sentence is a premise. The second sentence is a premise, and this author's conclusion is the final sentence here. And as Olivia says, thus is a synonym to the word therefore. They basically mean the same thing. So awesome. This is exactly what I want you to do for every single argument on this participation activity. We've already done one collectively. We did number 2. Now I want you to do 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 as well. Now for number 9 and number 10, I'm asking you to do something a little bit different. For number 9 and 10, they're slightly longer arguments. They're not just 1 paragraph long, they're 3 paragraphs long. And for these, I want you to just write out what you think the conclusion to each of these 2 arguments is. You don't have to do any circling or underlining. You just have to write the conclusion down here for number 9 and write the conclusion down here for number 10. And one tricky thing is that sometimes in arguments not explicitly stating the conclusion, sometimes an author doesn't actually say what their conclusion is, which is tricky. And so for one of these, the conclusion might not be explicitly stated. And then the second page of this is one big old long argument written by Barack Obama on gun control. And this whole essay right here, all whatever, 700 to 800 words of it, is one giant argument. And what I want you to do is summarize Obama's argument in nice, neat premise conclusion format. And there's space for you to do that at the very bottom here. And when I mean nice, neat premise conclusion format, I mean like this. You write down, this is what I think P1 is, and then whatever, just spell it out. And then this is what I think P2 is. And maybe you think there are 3 total premises. This is what I think P3 is. And then here's what I think the conclusion is. That's my made-up language. That's what I want you to do. You're not going to rewrite all of this. I want you to think of it as a summary. Maybe like this whole paragraph right here, this entire paragraph is one giant premise. And maybe you can summarize this one giant paragraph as a single sentence in your argument. And then maybe like these 2 paragraphs are themselves one giant premise. And so maybe you can spend one of your sentences summarizing these 2 paragraphs down to one sentence. That's a lot. That's just a skill we're going to be practicing throughout this class, and this is your first chance to do that. So you want to do this. A reminder with how I grade these participation activities, as long as you finish the entire participation activity and hand it in on time, you will get the full credit, all 25 points out of a possible 25 points. I will not grade this on how well you do, in other words. You could get this perfect, you'll get a 25 out of 25. You could get some wrong, you'll still get a 25 out of 25. You could get every single one of these wrong, but as long as you tried to answer every single one, you will still get a full 25 points out of 25 points. That's why these are called participation activities. This is just a chance for you to participate in developing the skills we're learning. This is a practice opportunity. There are no consequences for getting stuff wrong, as in fact, you learn best when you try and you maybe struggle a little bit and you don't get everything perfect the first time. Maybe it requires some effort to revise and get forward. So, questions, thoughts, concerns about this participation activity? So Facundo asks if they can throw an example of an argument to dissect. Absolutely, Facundo. You can either put it in the chat if you want, or you can go ahead and unmute yourself and let us know your example argument. Either way, go for it, Facundo. All right, so Facundo wrote, we shouldn't throw antibiotics down the drain or considering they accumulate in high concentrations at wastewater facilities where bacterial populations thrive. The elevated concentrations accelerate natural selection, producing multi-resistant bacteria faster, which we reintroduce into the environment. First off, this is an awesome argument if you just came up with it yourself. Or maybe you just found this online somewhere or something. Maybe you're just a fan of keeping our drains and toilets antibiotics free. I'm not sure. But what do you think is the conclusion to Facundo's argument? What is their main point? Read this whole thing. Which part of this do you think is the conclusion? All right, so Shanae says it's like the second part of the first sentence. Considering they accumulate in high concentrations at wastewater facilities where bacterial populations thrive. All right. Oh, Facundo says it was part of a research paper that they had to do for research in tech. Interesting. Nice. So this is your own writing. Awesome. Yeah. It feels like the sort of writing you would find out in the wild in like some sort of research paper that's been published. So Isabel says the conclusion is we shouldn't throw antibiotics down the drain or toilet. So both Shanae and Isabel are saying it's the first sentence, but you're disagreeing over which part of the first sentence it is. So Isabel goes with the first part of the first sentence. Shanae says it's the second part of the first sentence. So let's think a little bit about this. Are there any indicators in this particular argument that let us know this part's a premise, or any indicators that let us know this part's a conclusion? You see any words or phrases that might be helpful in that sort of way? Any premise indicators? Any conclusion indicators? So Shanae's going with no, 0 indicators. All right. Yeah. Certainly none of the indicators that we've talked about. There aren't any thuses or therefores or becauses or sinces, right? So I mentioned one in my example. Interesting. So for what it's worth, I do think there is a premise indicator in particular in this particular argument. Ooh, so Shanae says the word considering might be an indicator. I agree. I think the word considering is a premise indicator, and that's literally what Helen just typed. So awesome, very nice. Yeah, considering is trying to say like, consider the following evidence. I'm going to conclude something considering the following sort of evidence. Here's what I'm going to conclude. Don't throw antibiotics down. Here's why. Considering they accumulate in high concentrations, that leads to high bacteria. That elevates certain things. That leads to other problems. These are bad things. That's why we shouldn't throw antibiotics down the drain. considering that they lead to these sorts of problems. As Olivia says, this is evidence we're listing after we've listed the conclusion. So based off of that type of analysis of this argument, I'm with what Isabel said. I think the very first part of the first sentence is the conclusion. I think the conclusion is we shouldn't throw antibiotics down the drain. I think that's what we would put in this particular case. We shouldn't throw, I can't spell, antibiotics down the drain. And I would say our main reason for drawing that as the conclusion is that we've got a premise indicator. In this particular case, it's the word considering. That's another type of word that lets us know here comes some evidence, considering the following evidence. So excellent job. I really like that example, Facundo. I'm glad you brought that one up. That's a good one to practice with. All right. So Helen says that she knows this is off topic, but she checked the group documents and she's not in any of the groups. That's right. There are about 4 or 5 of you in our class who did not fill out the poll from last week that I used to get you all into groups. So 4 or 5 of you, Helen included, are not in a group yet. And at the end of our live session today, which will be happening somewhat soon, we're going to be getting you into those groups. And the 4 or 5 of you who aren't into groups will not get into those groups, but I will assign you into those groups at that time. We'll have a conversation when everybody else goes off to their groups to try to get you into one of those groups. So thanks for asking that, Helen. We will be addressing that in probably 15 minutes or so, something along the lines of that. All right, so let's see here. Yep, no problem. All right, so what I want to do now is talk about the other graded thing for class this week. We've already got this participation activity. Now I want to talk a little bit about your discussion questions and your discussion posts for this week, and also connected to what you're going to be doing next week. Because what I'm doing this week is asking you to do something that's a little bit vulnerable, and I want it in its proper context. I want to explain why it is I'm doing this. So in this particular week, I'm asking you to come up with an argument that defends a controversial stance that you happen to hold. So I'm asking you to put yourself out there and just say something controversial in this particular class. Well, the reason why I'm doing this is as follows. The big challenge that we have when it comes to understanding arguments is what's called disconfirmation bias. We have this tendency when we read an argument that we disagree with to instantly want to jump to evaluating and criticizing that argument. Our impulse when someone argues for a conclusion that goes against our core belief is to criticize that argument, is to jump straight to the evaluation stage before we do any understanding. This is all of the little cartoon panels from that first week oatmeal cartoon that I asked us to read. This is something I want us to fight against, and I want us to practice understanding arguments, particularly understanding arguments toward conclusions that go against our core beliefs. So that's why I'm asking you to, in this unit, pick a controversial topic. Talk about abortion, talk about Trump, talk about Black Lives Matter, talk about any particular controversial stance that you want, and you're defending it here. But it's for the purpose so that next week, what the Unit 4 discussion question is all about is I'm going to ask you all to pick another student's argument that you disagree with and summarize their argument. So that's the reason why we're discussing all these controversial arguments this unit. So that next unit, all of you are going to get a chance to just summarize and understand each other's arguments. And I'm going to ask you next week to, on purpose, pick someone else's argument toward a conclusion you disagree with. So Shanae, I see your hands up. Go ahead and unmute yourself. Tell us your thoughts.
Okay, so Unit 3, we're just going to defend our opinion. So we're not going to tell anybody about our premise, our conclusion, anything. We're just going to describe it and why other people would think that our opinion is not okay.
Yeah, so I would just say all you're doing is describing your own opinion. You're saying your opinion and you're backing it up. So you're kind of doing what Facundo just did in the chat, or you're doing, except I don't think their argument was particularly controversial. But you're picking some sort of topic and defending it, just like you're coming up with an argument. That's it. Does that make sense, Shanae?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So Olivia, your hand is up as well. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
So for our response, that's due tomorrow. So we have to pick a topic and then, explain or whatever. But do we have to respond to other people? Or?
Yeah, so this week you're still going to you're still going to do that. And you can still respond in whatever intellectually productive way you think is appropriate. So as Shantae asked a similar question in the chat, so your initial post that's due tomorrow is just what I said. When you're replying between Saturday and the Wednesday deadlines, when you're replying twice, the main thing I want you to do this week is be respectful with each other. You'll get a chance to summarize each other's arguments next week, but this week I want you to discuss other people's arguments from the context of what we're learning in class this week. Think about them as arguments. Think about them as premises and a conclusion. Try to sort of connect it just to what we're learning. And next week, you're going to get a chance to summarize someone else's argument. And then what will happen when you start replying next week to other people's posts is you can talk about how good a job you think people did summarizing people's arguments. And by the way, next week, you're not only going to be summarizing people's arguments, you're going to be still figuring people's arguments, and you're going to be talking about how it felt to summarize an argument you disagree with. Not evaluating the argument, not criticizing the argument, just understanding and defending an argument you don't like. That's going to feel like a weird process. So next week, you'll have a lot more to discuss in terms of how it felt. This week, you're just going to be writing out your controversial arguments and having discussions about them. So this week is kind of a weird free-for-all. I get that there's something vulnerable about this, but I want you to try to be respectful with each other this week, knowing that the context of this in this particular class is towards that particular goal of just trying to understand before you criticize. Both this week and next week, all I want you to be focusing on is that skill of understanding more than anything else. Other questions, thoughts, or concerns about either of these discussion posts in Unit 3 or Unit 4? All right, Barbara's got no questions. All right, so what I would like to do now, we've gotten to the point where we were supposed to get to evaluating arguments today, but I'm just going to push that off into next week. So what we'll end class with today, our live session, is with what I mentioned before and what Helen just brought up. I want to get you all into the groups you've been assigned to for your group projects on each particular fallacy. So let's see, I'm going to go back to here. Now, if you are on Blackboard right here, am I on the right one? Oh, I've got to go back to student preview to see this. Let's see, I'll go back to here. If you scroll down in your course menu to the very bottom, you're going to see that you have something called My Groups. And under My Groups, there's a little tab that lists what group you are in. So it might be group 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or 8. That's going to be your basic like home page for your group. Now, if you go to the course content page and then Under Unit 3, you can see at the very bottom here, group project groups and guidelines. Right here is the list of everybody's group that you are in. It's listed right here. So you can just see David, Emma, and Facundo are in group 1. Courtney, Corey, Isabel, and Shanae are in group 2, etc., all the way down through this. All groups 1 through 8. What I would like you to do right now is go to, under your My Groups, whatever group number you are, go to this Collaborate page right here and join your group room so that you and all your other group members will be in a room together so that you can exchange contact information. Give each other your phone numbers, give each other your emails, whatever your preferred method of getting in touch with each other is, so that you can begin the process of working on these group projects. Now you know what your specific fallacy is for each of these. You can start beginning to research for your projects on this. Yeah, so Shanae says that's cool, nice. And yeah, Denzel and Helen and a couple other people are going to be able to do that. And for what it's worth, if you think that's cool, Shanae, you can always have this room available to you and just you and your group members to check out. So if you want to just meet quickly, you can always go to your group Collaborate room just to meet up and talk about stuff. So you don't have to set up a separate Zoom meeting or a Google Meet or something like that. This is where you can hang out and you can exchange all sorts of documents with each other in here and do all sorts of weird stuff. There's all sorts of things you can do in these groups. But that's what I want you to do. If you are someone like Helen or Denzel and you are not assigned in a group, I want you to stay in this room we're in right now, our class live session, and I will assign you into one of these groups. So I believe the people who still need to be assigned into groups are Liam, Denzel, Samuel, Helen, and Taylor. So you can, if your computer can handle it, you can be in both if you want. But this is the last thing we're doing as a collective class, Monique. So Monique says if you join a room, does it exit it out of this class? What I want you to do is exit out of this room and just join that room because we're going to be done for the day. Give me like 30 seconds to wrap up class. But that's going to be the end of our class for the day. So you don't have to come back to this class. Any questions, thoughts, or concerns before you get into those group rooms to exchange contact information? Right. I'm guessing by your silence the answer is no. So go ahead and go into those rooms right now. The few of you who still need to be in a room or to be gotten into a group, stick around. But the rest of you go into those rooms, have yourselves a nice week. I'll see you all next Friday. Enjoy everything happening with Unit 3 and enjoy your weekend. Bye, y'all. Yeah, see you too, Sam. You too, Barbara. You too, Olivia. Bye, Monique. Bye, Shantae. See you, Isabel. See you, Isabel. See you, Facundo. Bye, Iris. Thank you. Bye. You too, Franco. Bye, Ashley. All right, so let me see on my list. I know Denzel is here, Helen is here. I don't see Taylor or Samuel or Liam. So it looks like just Denzel and Helen need to be put into a group. So I'm going to show you the available slots we have right here. Pretty much any group that only has 3 members, you could join as a group. So the only group that's out for you, Helen, or for you, Denzel, is the Popular Appeal group. So pick one of these other groups that you would like to join, and I will put you into that group. What strikes your fancy, Denzel? What strikes your fancy, Helen? The Ad Hominem group, Appeal to Pity. All right, Helen, you're going to be in Appeal to Pity. So I'm going to try to literally assign you to that group right now really fast. All right. I think I can do that. And then the same I'll try to do for you, Denzel. Just give me a second. So Helen, I'm going to try to add to appeal to pity. And hopefully you can get in there right now as soon as I get you into that group. Where'd you go? I just saw you. There you are. Submit, submit. All right, what I'd like you to do, Helen, is refresh your Blackboard, and you should see now that little My Groups at the bottom, and you'll be in that appeal to pity group. You should be able to jump in right now. And Denzel, I'm going to do the awesome. So go ahead and join that group and say, hey, I'm a new group member. I just added to y'all. And I'm going to do the same thing for begging the question. That's group 6. I'm going to add you, Denzel, to group 6 real fast. Edit group. Add user. Let's see, where are you at, Denzel? Denzel. There you are. All right, submit. All right, same thing. You should now be in group 6. Go ahead and hit refresh, Denzel, and you should see your group, and then you could go there. All right, so Deshaun, how do you join? Here's what you do. You go to the very bottom here under My Groups. You'll find a little group name. You click on Collaborate, this first one right here, Deshaun, and then you'll see this little group room, and then you click on the right Join Room over here, and you'll join that room. Did you not see the Collaborate tab? Are you not in a group, Deshaun? You don't see the My Groups tab? Oh, on your phone it might be trickier. I'm not sure. It should be under course menu. You should have all this stuff that's just for critical thinking. And then at the very bottom, there should be some tab called My Groups. You don't see that on your phone? I don't know what it looks like on your phone, unfortunately. Yeah, try again. Look at the very bottom of your little course menu on your phone. Are you on the app, on the Blackboard app, or are you on like Safari on your phone or whatever? You're on the app? Yeah, I don't know what the app looks like. I've never used the app. All right.